Today's daf is daf Ches, and we'll start with the Rebbe Omar on the second line. If you recall, Rebbe accepted an equation between Nigei Haguf, which means Tsaras, and Nigei Batin. And in the light of that comparison, he came to the conclusion that just like the Torah explicitly teaches us that in Nigei Batim, the Kohen can postpone Re'iyas HaNega, for the sake of Upinu as HaKelim, taking the Kelim out, so too by analogy, in Tsaras, the Kohen has the right, Al Pidin, to delay Re'iyas HaNega. And now the Gemara wants to know, the Rebbe Omar, Itztrich, why do we need two psukim? And we have Biyom Haraos Bo, and we have Etzivo HaKohen. The Ikos of Rachmana Ubiyom Heros Bo, and that seems to indicate that there are certain days when he's not going to see the Nega. Hava Minu L'Dvar Mitzvah in L'Dvar Rishus Lo. The Torah is telling us that on days where you're involved in a mitzvah, like the Chasan, who's involved in Shivas Yimei Mishted, then we can postpone Re'iyas HaNega. However, Lidvar Rishus, simply for something that's just a Rishus, it's not a mitzvah, the Kohen would be obligated to see the Nega immediately. Is therefore Kosev Rachmana V'Tziva HaKohen, the Torah says that the Kohen shall determine whether or not it's Tameh, and this teaches us that he can postpone his investigation of the Nega. And Ve'ikos Rachmana V'Tziva Kohen, if we only had the pasuk V'Tziva Kohen in the parsha of Nigei Batim, Hava Mina Hani in Delav Tuma de Gufe. Aval Tuma de Gufe Ema Mechse Chazila. Perhaps the Torah was more lenient in a Tuma that's external to the body, like a case where there's a nega in the house, and there the Torah allows that flexibility of delaying the examination of the bais and its declaration of tumah. However, when it comes to a more serious kind of tumah, which is qualitatively more chomer, and that's tumah de gufe, in the case of tzaras, I would think that the Kohen immediately, he has to see and declare tumah immediately without delay. And therefore I need the pasuk ubiyom heros bo. And that's going to teach me that he's allowed to postpone his examination of the Nega Tzaras, even though it's Tumas Haguf. Tzricha, therefore I need two psukim. Omar Mar, we saw in the Brisa that we quoted on on Zion Amid Beis Yesh Yom Shata Roa Bo V'Yesh Yom Sheyata Roa Bo My Mashma. How do you derive from the pasuk ubiyom heros bo that this is to the exclusion of other days, like for example the days of the Chasan or Deva Regel, when there's no investigation of the Tzaras? Omar Abaye, and here we're going to have Machlok Shin Abaye V'Rava in Cain. Abaye says that the pasuk, if we take it literally, without this extra drasha, Licha Rachmana Biyom, my ubiyom, why the extra vav? And the answer is the extra vav is a mute, telling you that biyom, this is a day of Heros HaNega, and there's another day which is not Heros HaNega. Yesh Yom Shataroa Bo Yesh Yom Sheyataroa. Rava Amar, Rava says we might need the vav for something else, but kula kra yiserahu. The whole pasuk is redundant. Dim kain, because if you take the pasuk literally, lichov rachmanu ubehera os, leave out the whole biyom. Ubehera os, when the flesh of the mitzvah is examined, Maya ubiyom. The whole word ubiyom is completely redundant. Shmami, no, therefore we derive yesh yom chataroa bo yesh yom she'iyataroa. So the Gemara immediately asks, V'Abaye, why is it that Abaye considers the Vav as superfluous, and the rest of the pasuk biyom without the Vav is necessary? Why? Why do we need the word biyom? Rava argues very logically. It could have said behera os. And he answers Abaye, Haumi boile bayom uvlo balayla, that the halacha of a kohen of Heros Bo, that he investigates the nega, is only by day and not by night. Even if he can light up the night with, today we have electricity, in those days they had candles, it would not be sufficient. Because the Torah says biyom. Biyom means day and not laila. For Rava, why does Rava insist that the word bayom is superfluous? Abaye's argument is very logical and compelling. We need the word bayom to exclude laila. So Rava answers bayom v'lo balayla minole nafkale mi lechol mara einei hakohen. The Torah says, again in Perek Yud Gimel, as we said yesterday, in Vayikra, that the Mara Einei HaKohen has to be L'chol Mara Einei HaKohen, whenever the eyes of the Kohen can see, which implies that he has to view it during the daylight, when he can see it with his eyes, biyom. And biyom, it says L'chol Mara Einei HaKohen. Einei HaKohen means without the need for, shall we call it, artificial light. V'Abaye. What about Abaye? Abaye insists on deriving from the word bayom that the re'iyah has to be bayom and not balayla. Why not derive it from l'chol mara einei hakohen? Hahumi bayle lemute suma biachas me'einav. If the kohen is blind in one eye, then he's excluded and disqualified from investigating the tzaras. And we learn this from the fact that it says einei hakohen, both einayim. He could see it with both his eyes. I don't have the word bayom free to teach us that the examination of the mitzvah, the tzaras, has to take place bayom and not balayla. For Rava, Nami, Rava also should derive from the word bayom to the exclusion of a kohen who's blind in one eye. So Gemara at this point makes an about face and concedes in the context of Rava that we need the pasuk bayom. It's not superfluous. So what is Rava's opinion here? How is Rava going to find an alternative pasuk to exclude examination by night without using biyom heraos? Because that we need for something else to exclude a kohen who's blind in one eye. And yet Rava insists that the word of bayom is superfluous. So you must have some source from which you disqualify a re'iyah balayla. And the Gemara says, Nafkalon mi kinega nira li babayis. Kinega means something that looks like an affliction is in the bias. Li, why did the Torah add the word li? Velolio ri. Not through any external aid like candlelight to help me see it, or rather nira li, I can see it alone by myself, independent of any external light. So that's going to exclude Lila, where we need the candlelight. Mebele, the word bayom is superfluous, and you don't have to build your case on the extra vav. V'Abaye. Abaye says that I need the word bayom to exclude Lila. Why don't I derive the exclusion of Lila from the pasuk li? Kinega nira li babayis. Havamina, if I only had the pasuk of kinega nira li babayis, hani milituma delav begufe, I would have limited this halacha dafka in its context to the case of nigei batim, which is lav migufe. Avol tuma the gufe is afilu li oro nami. Even if he does the b'dik at night and he relies on the external light of a candle, that would be a perfectly legitimate b'dika. And again, this is a chumrah expanding the ability to determine that this saras phenomenon, he's indeed a mitzora, even if we see it at night with candlelight. And that's the conclusion I would have derived if I only had the pasuk in the parsha of Nigei Batim, Kenega Nira Liba Bayis. Kamash Malan, therefore I need the pasuk, Ubiyom Heros Bo, and that's going to teach me that this exclusion of Lila that we derive from the pasuk Nira Liba Bayis in the parsha of Nigei Batim, which is not a Tuma Migufe, applies equally well to Tumah Migufe in the case of Saras, and the examination has to be by day and not by night. And therefore, by of the position that only the Vav is extra, and it teaches us that there's a Yom She'eno Nirelov She'iyatoro. And now we're up to the Mishnah here on Daf Ches Omera. V'od Omer Rabbi Meir. Now we're getting into the laws of Chol Moed in terms of malach. And Rabbi Meir says, Malaked Adam Atzmos Aviv Ve'imo Mipnei Shesimchi Lo. Very, very strange halach. Let's fast forward to Rabbi Yossi, which is a little easier, and then we'll backtrack to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Evel Hu Lo. The concept of likud atzamos, to gather the bones of a father and mother and rebury them somewhere else for whatever reason. It's not safe where it is now. We want to transfer it to another burial place. That's avel. That's avelus. And even if a person sat shiva and he was misabel in the past for his late father or late mother, nevertheless, he's got to have another avelus when he takes out the bones in order to reinter them elsewhere. And therefore, this is not something that's appropriate for the Moed, for Chol Moed, because Chol Moed is a day of Simcha, V'samachta, V'chagecha, and this is antithetical to Simcha. Likud Atzamos is Avelus. What is the opinion of Rabbi Meir? Simcha Hilo. After all, his father is buried in a place that now became a dumping ground. You know, it's not a pleasant place to be buried. Perhaps even to reinter him in Eretz Yisrael in certain cases. You have to know the laws. So it's a simcha to him that he's able to reinter his father or his mother. The Mishnah continues, there's a certain period of time before Yontif, when if you start knocking on doors to eulogize the deceased and you sort of inspire this grief and mourning, it's going to have a negative impact on Yontif and Simchas Yontif. V'lo yaspidenu, we'll see what that means. You don't eulogize. Kodem l'regel shloshim yom. That 30-day period before the Chag, that's the period of time that we're talking about, and the Gemara is going to explain why. First, let's get to Rabbi Meir's Kula in the Mishnah about Likud Atzomos. Reminu Hamalakit Atzomos of V'ima Areza Misabel Aleim Kol Hayom. He gets 1 day of Avelus, which means the following: that in the original Avelus, which is 1 day D'Oraisa Achrisa Kiyomar, and the balance of the 7 days, the other 6 days are the Rabbanon. In the case of Likud Atzomos, we only take the Avelus D'Oraisa of the first day. And that's called Misabel Aleim Kol Hayom. Le'erev, after that day passes, Ein Misabel Aleim, that terminates the Avelus. The Omer of Chizda, Afilu Tzrurim Lo Bisdino, even if the bones are wrapped up in a sheet, which means that he hasn't yet reinterred the bones into the proper grave. He remains in the state of mourning, of Avelus, indefinitely, until the deceased is buried. So we see clearly that when you gather together the atzamos of a parent, it generates a period of Avelus. How then could that be permissible, according to Rabbi Meir on Chol Moed, which is a mitzvah of Simcha? Avelus and Simcha, mutually exclusive. Amar Abaye, Ema, we have to reinterpret Rabbi Meir, Mipnei shesimchas haregel olam. The joy of the regel is upon him. In other words, the Avelus for Likud Atzomus is not on the same intense grief and mourning as it is originally when they buried his parents, his father, his mother. And therefore, in that lesser madreg of Avelus, the simcha of V'samachta b'chagecha over, trumps the feelings of Avelus when it's that Avelus on that lower level, on a low fire. So the joy of the simcha and Avelus of Yontif is so great that the Avelus here is completely batal and mevutal, and there's no need to prohibit likud atzamos. So again, not the way we initially understood the statement here of Rabbi Yehuda, of Rabbi Meir, just simcha hilo, literally that burying the dead is a simcha, but rather that Yontif is a great simcha. And it will not be stirred by that day of Avelus. The Mishnah says, Lo ya'ar al meso, he doesn't knock around on doors to try to get people to to wail and cry about his mess during that period of time of Yontif. Milo ya'ar al meso omarav kad hodar saftana b'marava. There was a saftana, professional eulogist. His job was he got paid for eulogizing. He would travel around the West, meaning in Eretz Yisrael. Amri Yivchun ime kol merire liba. Weep with him all those who are brokenhearted. So basically, he had the power by inviting other people to grieve with him and join in the eulogy and the kinos, the laments over their dead. And he was very, very powerful emotionally. So this is antithetical to Simchas Yontif. But now the Mishnah goes ahead and says, Kodem Regel Shloshim Yom, that this prohibition about inspiring mourning and grief and lamentations and eulogizing, this only applies within 30 days of Yontif. But Kodem Regel Shloshim Yom, before that, it's okay. So Maishno Shloshim Yom, why do we pinpoint this 30-day period of time? Amar Rav Kahana, Amar Rav Yehuda Marav, Maise ba'adam echad shekine smos lalos l'regel. He had gathered together his funds to take the trek to Yerushalayim for the regel. Ubas safton v'yomen al pesach beiso. And one of these professional, traveling eulogists came by and knocked on the door and offered to lament the loss of whatever relative it was. The funds that her husband had gathered together in order to ascend to Yerushalayim for the Yontif, to Mekayim the Mitzvah Aliyah L'Regel, she took those funds and she gave it to him and paid him wages for his eulogy. As a result, her husband could not gather together replacement funds. He didn't have the money to go to Yerushalayim, and he didn't go on Aliyah L'Regel. As a result of that incident, Chazal made a statement. Lo ya'orer al meso v'lo yaspidenu kodem l'regel shloshim yom. To be ma'orer and inspire people for kinos and crying and so forth, al meso or hesped to eulogize him, it's got to be kodem l'regel shloshim yom. It's got to be more than 30 days before the regel. And that is the opinion of Ra. And the Mefarshim, Rashi, and others connect this with the famous sugya Psachim Dafav of Chayev Adam Lidrosh V'Lishol B'Inyonik Shel Yom Chag Shloshim Yom. So the study of the festival laws begins 30 days in advance of Yontif, and this is when people commonly begin setting aside money for festival use. The prohibition against hiring a eulogist applies for 30 days. And it's enforced even nowadays when there's no Beis HaMikdash, because the extra funds are needed for general festival expenses. Shmuel Amar, and here we turn to Moed Beis. A person is very intensely, psychologically, profoundly involved in grief and mourning for 30 days before he can forget the tragedy, the loss of one of his relatives. That means that 30 days have to pass. If we were going to eulogize him within that 30-day period, then we are, so to speak, awakening the fresh memory of that person during the Chag, during the Regel period, and that would undermine the Simcha of Chol Hamoed. Not only that, if we were to eulogize him within 30 days of the Chag, the memory would still be fresh during the Chag. People might come to eulogize him even during the Chag. And according to Shmuel, the prohibition against eulogizing pertains only to one who died more than 30 days before the festival. If someone died within 30 days of the festival, then he may be eulogized then, since the grief of his death is still fresh in the heart, and a eulogy will not add to it. My Beinayu, is there a practical difference between these two shitos, Rav and Shmuel? Rav, who says that Lo Ya'aral Meso V'Yaspidenu Kodem Shloshim Yom, and Shmuel, who derives this from a whole different source, because Eina Meis Mishtakeach Min Alev Shloshim Yom, Ika Beinayu Deka'aviv B'Chinam, a case where the eulogist is not charging fees, he does it gratis. And this is going to be a case of the nafkamina between Rav and Shmuel. According to Rav, it's mutter. The only concern was you might spend, your festival funds to pay the eulogist, as we saw in the incident that his wife gave up his festival funds for paying a eulogist. But in this case, the eulogist is offering his services for free, gratis, and therefore it should be mutter. But according to Shmuel, it's awesome because the eulogy will cause the person's grief to extend even into the festival. Okay, then that leads us to the Mishnah here on the top of Daf Ches Moed Beis.